The stories. The silent hospital wing with alleged final footage. The north wing stayed quiet after visiting hours, and the only noise came from vents that clicked like tired metronomes. Staff shared the same phrase for years, reportedly calling it the silent hallway where the lights hummed slightly brighter. Mara Kincaid was 34, and she worked nights as a charge nurse who still wrote notes by hand. She liked predictable rounds, and she liked checking the machines herself because she trusted beeps less than faces. On a rainy Thursday, her simple goal was to finish a wound check, sign a stack of orders, and clock out. The shift began with a late dinner in the break room, and it seemed like the kind of night nothing remembers. Ronan Vale was 36, and he supervised maintenance with a patience that came from old factory work. He carried a pocket radio with a broken antenna, and he logged every outlet test like it mattered to someone. The incident started when a patient in the north wing pressed his call button, then silence followed without any voice reply. The archived call log showed the button was held for 5 seconds, then released, then tapped again 3 times. Mara reached the door first, and she cleared her throat before pushing with her shoulder, since the latch stuck on humid nights. The room was empty, and the bed rails were up, and the bathroom light was on without any water running. She checked the hallway camera by the nurse's station, and the feed had frozen on a frame where no one stood. Ronan arrived with a service cart, and he frowned, and he asked if anyone had patched the camera since last quarter. "Patient transfer, maybe," Mara said, and she kept her voice low because the corridor carried everything. "I never got a page about a transport." Ronan pulled the maintenance binder, and he pointed at an entry from 2019 that mentioned a power fluctuation. "Different camera," he said, and his thumb tapped the page like a small hammer, finishing an obvious nail. They checked the bed chart, and the name line only held initials, because the unit had privacy rules for sensitive admissions. The time of admission was listed as 2200, and the diagnosis read observation, and nothing else was printed. A housekeeper named Iola Reyes rolled a linen hamper by them, and she said the patient asked earlier about the stairwell. Witness statements later noted she had not seen a badge on the patient wrist, and she remembered the smell of antiseptic. Mara searched the bathroom, and she counted 5 cotton swabs in the trash, along with 2 adhesive tabs that had curled. She took a photo with the hospital phone, and the flash startled her because she had forgotten to disable the shutter sound. Ronan opened the ceiling tile by the door, and he peered at the cable run that fed the camera and the smoke sensor. He found a hairline crack in the conduit, and a tiny curl of metal shaving rested on the tile like a silver thread. They followed policy, and they called security, and a guard named Derry Boone wrote the time on his palm with a marker. His radio squawked, and dispatch logs later captured the clipped exchange that said North Wing camera frozen since 2215. The investigation moved across small squares of evidence, and every piece felt ordinary until each piece started fitting. Mara pulled prior vitals from the network, and the last reading on that room was normal. Then the device stopped sending updates. Ronan replayed earlier camera clips from other angles, and he found 5 seconds where the emergency exit alert blinked. Witness statements reported no alarm sounded on the floor, which suggested a silenced switch or a failed buzzer behind the plate. They visited the stairwell, and it smelled like wet concrete, and there were footprints that pulled dirt up in little arches. The toe pattern looked like patient socks, and a scuff line dragged for a foot, then stopped, and then resumed. Iola walked the corridor with them, and she rested her hands on the hamper edges like it was a steering wheel. He asked if the vending machine ever takes bills this late, she said, and her tone was apologetic without a reason. Mara checked the cafeteria camera archive, and she searched timestamps between 2200 and 2230 without breaks. The footage showed vending lights flicker and a rolling reflection of the ice machine door, and no patient approached either. Ronan called the on-call electrician, and he asked for a line test on the north wing circuits beyond the junction. The electrician reportedly answered from a truck outside, and he said storms cause weird ghosts when the backup inverter handshakes incorrectly. Security reviewed vehicle gates, and the record showed no exits, and it showed 1 ambulance arrival and 1 taxi inbound turn. The taxi camera caught rain on the lens, and the shapes in the frame appeared like shadows pretending to be people moving. Mara walked back to the room, and she sat in the visitor chair, and she looked at the bed like a stage. The sheets held a diagonal crease that suggested someone sat on the edge, then changed their mind, and stood slowly. She noticed a folded paper beneath the pillow, and it was hospital stationery, and the writing was cramped and slanted. The note read, "They said, I would sleep here for observation. I only asked for quiet. I will make it quiet myself." She showed Ronan, and he raised his eyebrows, and he said, "People write strange lines when they want control again." "Could be a statement," he said. And he took a photo, and he set the paper back where it had been resting. They checked the elevator camera on the service lift, and they saw no one. And they saw the doors hesitate twice without reason. The maintenance panel log showed a fault code that matched a sticky optical sensor, which could create a false occupancy reading. Security walked the roof, and raindrops traveled in sheets, and the helicopter pad lights buzzed, and the wind pulled at the harness. No prints held on the rubber mat under that weather, and the team recorded nothing except water pooling near a drain. Mara called the number listed for the initials on the chart, and the voicemail answered with a generic greeting without a name. The archived calls showed she left a message, and she marked the record for a social worker referral the next morning. The twist arrived from a workstation that handled the wing-wide overnight monitor board, which recorded short clips for training. Ronan found a separate storage folder, and he found files with timestamps that matched the frozen camera, which suggested a mirrored buffer. He played the file, and the first seconds held the empty corridor, and the lights hummed, and the vents clicked rhythmically. Then a figure stepped into frame from the bathroom, and the face stayed bowed, and the person held a small device. The figure pressed the call button, and waited, and pressed again, and then looked directly into the lens with a steady expression. The person wore a blue patient gown, and there was no bracelet, and a square of bandage covered the left forearm. The figure spoke one line, and the audio kept popping, and the words were difficult but not impossible, and they landed heavily. The line sounded like, "Please log this as a discharge without paper. I will return the quiet that was promised tonight." The figure leaned toward the hallway exit and held up a magnet key that looked improvised from a maintenance badge shell. Ronan froze the frame, and he zoomed carefully, and he compared the lanyard clip to older staff models from storage. He opened a drawer on his cart, and he pulled a shadowed badge, and the clip matched the same notched jaw. He remembered a report from 2011 that mentioned missing spares, and he realized the old inventory never reconciled fully. Mara watched the clip again, and she noticed the brief stop at the door where the hand paused near the hinge. The person shifted weight, and the gown hem lifted, and a glimpse of ankle revealed a piece of linen tied like cord. They searched the linen cart and found a torn sheet corner and a tight knot that matched the quick tie and frame. Witness statements sometimes miss small habits, and this one felt like proof that the same hands moved through every part. Security traced the stairwell door with a flashlight, and the latch plate held a line of smudged residue near the tongue. The residue smelled faintly of hand sanitizer, and the drizzle likely washed everything else, and a small rectangle mark remained. Ronan printed the frame, and he marked the hallway clock on the wall, and then drew a diagonal line. If the figure left at that angle, he reasoned, then the person would pass the decommissioned lab and the loading dock walkway. They opened the door to the old lab, and stale air settled on their shoulders, and a single emergency light hummed. A small stool sat under the wall phone, and the receiver was off, and the dispatch recorded 2 seconds of static. The loading dock camera had the clearest view, and the rain helped by shining every surface like a clean mirror. The figure emerged under the overhang and paused and placed the improvised badge on the scale and stared at the red numbers. Mara said quietly that people sometimes need clocks that have nothing to do with time, and Ronan nodded without looking away. The figure moved toward the far gate, and the frame caught a truck pulling in, and the headlamps blinded the sensor briefly. The alleged final footage ended with the figure stepping beyond the painted yellow line, and the clip cut to black. The storage folder wrote a partial next file, and the timestamp advanced 1 minute, and the next image showed only rain and darkness. Security canvassed the area beyond the gate the next morning, and they found a blue paper cap in a pothole. A supermarket clerk down the road later told them privately that a person in a gown bought a jacket before sunrise. The clerk described a steady voice and a careful posture, and a request for the cheapest jacket that still had a zipper. She remembered a folded square of tape on the person's wrist, and she said the person counted bills with deliberate focus. Mara filed the incident summary, and she kept the note line without interpretation because her job was to record and proceed. She added the sentence about the linen tie, and she added the part about the magnet key, and she kept the tone steady. Ronan wrote a maintenance report that asked for a complete audit of old badge hardware and an updated inventory process. He requested a camera firmware refresh schedule, and he recommended replacing the corridor conduit that carried the vulnerable signal run. The hospital quietly changed the North Wing protocol, and now every quiet room kept a visitor log under a laminated sheet. Nurses checked the stairwell latch every round, and security scanned badge shells weekly, and housekeeping marked any torn linens. Months later, a social worker forwarded a letter to administration, and it mentioned a patient who left without signing. The message said the person had revisited, reportedly during a volunteer day, and returned the improvised badge in a sealed envelope. The letter closed with a single sentence that matched the tone of that night and felt like a bookend that fit. The person wrote, "Please remove my initials from the board. My observation ended when your hallway stopped pretending to be quiet." Mara read that line twice in silence, and she folded the paper and she placed it in the confidential binder. She stood outside the North Wing and she listened to the vents and she heard the hum as part of routine. Ronan installed the new camera and he tightened the bracket and he watched the live feed while the corridor waited. The picture captured only light and doors and floor, and that was the point, and he signed the work order neatly. Staff still tell the story in pieces, and they keep the facts close and the phrasing softer than rumors deserve. Most say the footage is final because it ends, and because endings feel like decisions, even when the person continues somewhere else. The hospital kept the clip off the training servers, and only a few supervisors can access the mirrored buffer folder. They treat it with the same caution they give to old X-rays, and they open it only when policies turn uncertain. When the night quiets, the North Wing sounds the same as any other hallway, with that hum that never quits. People who know the incident say quiet is never silence, and they say promises can be kept without anyone hearing the words. If the figure returns again, security will log the time, and maintenance will test the lines, and nursing will keep notes. The story already taught them that quiet can hide intentions, and that evidence can walk on socked feet and still register. Mara keeps working nights, and she still checks machines in person, and she still trusts faces more than recorded beeps. Ronan keeps his pocket radio, and he keeps sharpening his pencil with a knife, and he keeps circling dates on forms. They do not trade theories in the break room, because theories cannot start IVs, and they cannot prevent skipped alarms. They keep procedures updated, and they keep the story within policy, and they let the hallway be simply a hallway again. When someone new asks about the silent North Wing, staff shrug with a practiced economy that looks almost like kindness. They know quiet can be a boundary people choose, and they know cameras capture frames, and they know choices finish off screen. The hallway holds steady under the lights, and the vents click, and the doors breathe slightly as pressure shifts slowly. Whatever happened that night belongs to lines and logs and to a voice recorded over rain, asking for uncomplicated quiet. In the end, the building remembers through everyday details and people remember through work, and that is usually enough. The North Wing remains quiet, not empty, and the lesson sits on a shelf with a label that only insiders recognize. The stories. Why this librarian reopened a cold map drawer. In late September of 2014, the Quiet Town Library off Route 47 got a new head librarian named Corinne Ashland. She was 39, a former archivist who'd spent years cataloging geological surveys for a state university. By all accounts, Corinne wasn't the kind of person to chase ghosts until the day she decided to reopen an old, locked map drawer that everyone else had forgotten. The drawer sat in the basement stacks, labeled Time State Topography 1952 to 1958 asterisk. Its brass handle had gone dull with age, and the key was missing. For years, staff used the cabinet as a makeshift table for coffee mugs and boxes of donations. But one morning, while rearranging a shipment of donated atlases, Corinne noticed a faint rust-colored smear near the label. It looked like dried clay or maybe iron dust. Either way, it didn't belong there. She mentioned it to her assistant, and he laughed, saying, "That drawer's cursed. Ask Mrs. Langley. She swears a surveyor disappeared working on those maps." Corinne smiled politely, but something in her stayed hooked on the idea. She asked around. The drawer dated back to when the building served as a records annex for the county planning office. In the mid-50s, several regional floodplain studies were stored there before the files were relocated or supposedly relocated to the state archives. No one ever verified that. When Corinne checked the archive's digital inventory, she found gaps. 4 missing surveys, all from the same year, 1957. They covered a stretch of riverland that was later condemned for a hydroelectric project that never materialized. That evening, Corinne used a universal key set kept for restoration work and opened the map drawer for the first time in decades. Inside were rolled parchments bound with cotton strings, their edges yellowed. Beneath them, she found a tin box wrapped in wax paper. Inside the box lay a water-stained notebook, a compass with a cracked lens, and a faded photograph of 2 men standing beside a field the size of a football stadium, ringed by survey poles. On the back of the photo, someone had written, asterisk, last day before the dig, GM asterisk. Corinne scanned the initials against old employment rosters. There was a Gregory Malon, a field engineer who'd gone missing in June of 1958. Officially, he'd left the project for family reasons, but the local paper from that summer told a stranger story. Asterisk, surveyor vanishes near proposed reservoir site. Search suspended after 3 days. Asterisk, no follow-up, no body recovered. Corinne started a file. 1. She called the county records department. A man named Leland Cross, an aging clerk who'd worked there since the 70s, remembered something. Mahlan. Yeah? He was working on the Franklin Bend plan. Whole thing got shelved when the funding dried up. I heard his partner quit soon after. Leland didn't recall the partner's name, but he mentioned an old storage trailer the county once kept near the riverbank. They hauled the trailer out after a flood in the 60s, he said. If anything survived, it's in the historical depot now. The depot was just a few miles away. Corinne drove there that weekend, signed in as a researcher, and requested the Franklin Bend materials. The clerk brought her a warped cardboard box smelling of mildew. Inside were soil samples, invoices, and a reel of magnetic tape marked Audio Log 4 field notes. She had to borrow an old player from the depot staff. The recording was faint, but clear enough to recognize 2 male voices. Asterisk, Greg, you're not logging this, right? Asterisk. Asterisk. Relax. It's just us. But if this ridge keeps sinking, we need to report it. Asterisk. Relax. Relax. Asterisk. Asterisk. We will. After the last survey, the company can't afford another delay. Asterisk. The tape ended with wind noise and a scrape, like a microphone hitting dirt. Corinne replayed it 3 times, listening for landmarks. At one point, one of them mentioned mile marker 12 and the culvert by the sycamores. Using digitized topographic maps, she traced those features to a narrow bend along the river, now fenced off as private land. When she brought this to the local sheriff's office, the deputy shrugged. If you're talking about Mahlan, that case is older than my dad. We can't go digging around on private property for a rumor. But Corinne wasn't chasing rumor. She was following evidence. She emailed a geologist friend from her university days, Dr. Theo Ricks, who specialized in landslide patterns. Theo ran a ground-penetrating radar survey along that same bend under a research permit for soil erosion. The data showed a deep subsidence pocket about 20 feet from the current riverline, consistent with an old collapsed tunnel. Theo sent her the printout and a note, asterisk, you might have just found their camp trench. Asterisk. They returned together a week later. Theo handled the radar equipment while Corinne recorded the coordinates. Near sunset, a small piece of metal surfaced from the silt, a corroded survey tripod leg, stamped Property of Franklin Bend Hydro Limited. The find was modest, but it confirmed the crew had worked exactly where she predicted. From that point, Corinne began piecing the timeline. The notebook from the tin box mentioned sudden soil shifts, pressure readings, and the phrase asterisk, map variance, river shift, not natural. Asterisk. The handwriting was Malan's, matching samples from his earlier reports. It appeared he suspected someone had deliberately diverted a drainage channel to falsify flood risk data, possibly to inflate land value before government acquisition. If true, exposing it could have derailed the whole project. The company had millions at stake. Mahlan filed his last note 2 days before he vanished. Corinne cross-checked the company records and found the corporation dissolved in 1961, right after a quiet lawsuit settlement with an undisclosed party. No public record linked it to Mahlan. But tucked inside the notebook's back cover, hidden beneath the lining, she found a short letter addressed to M.R. Hanley, attorney at law. It never got mailed. The ink was blurred but readable enough. Asterisk, they moved the stakes. If anything happens, check the revised map in drawer C. It's the only truth left. Asterisk. Drawer C was the one she'd opened. By early winter, local journalists picked up her findings. The county authorized a limited excavation, mainly to verify the historic maps. When workers dug near the subsidence pocket, they uncovered remnants of an old metal barrel containing drafting tools and fragments of canvas. Among them was a wristwatch, glass shattered, still faintly engraved, asterisk GM, asterisk dental fragments. Nearby, later confirmed Malan's identity. The discovery didn't just solve a missing person case, it revealed a quiet cover-up. The original floodplain data, preserved in those maps, showed the river was unstable long before developers planned the reservoir. Ignoring it had likely saved the investors short-term losses, but cost one man his life. The county issued a formal acknowledgement of error, though no one alive faced charges. The land was later rezoned as a conservation area. Corinne kept working at the library, though people now came from all over asking about the librarian who solved the map mystery. She never took credit beyond saying she just followed what was left behind. The old drawer was cleaned, cataloged, and displayed behind glass with the tin box and the compass inside. Every so often, she'd unlock the case to polish the brass handle, and she'd think about Mahlan's note, the way he wrote Time's the only truth left, asterisk. She understood now that archives aren't just about paper or ink, they're about the things people try to bury, and the few who still choose to look. By the next spring, the library basement smelled of fresh paint. The drawer sat quietly in its corner, again, cool metal against the hum of fluorescent lights. And that was enough. No headlines, no dramatics, just a reminder that sometimes reopening the past isn't about curiosity. It's about letting someone finally be found. The cabin door that never opened in Hoonah, Alaska. Locals in Hoonah still mention a cabin off Port Frederick where a door reportedly refused to open during a search. The story circulates in marina talk and winter gatherings when icy straight winds push boats against the floats. People repeat details from memory and clipped reports, then pause when the timeline begins to blur. They say nothing supernatural happened, yet the door remains the problem everyone avoids naming. The central figure was 47, a maintenance carpenter named Richard Vale who came to Hoonah for seasonal repairs on public cabins. He carried a tidy set of tools and a habit of writing dates on masking tape inside hinge plates. His stated goal was simple work and steady pay, while his brother managed their mother's treatment in Juneau. He rented a room above the harbor office and paid cash for fuel and dry goods. According to archived notes at the city office, neighbors saw Richard wheel a cart of lumber down the boardwalk on a Wednesday. The weather held bright and cold, with early ice clinging to the shaded rocks along the shoreline. He loaded the skiff before noon and told a harbor aide he planned to check a cabin up Port Frederick by evening. The aide reportedly reminded him about a predicted squall that might arrive after nightfall. Dispatch logs from that week show routine calls for ferry coordination and a stranded truck near Game Creek. Richard's name appears once with a simple request for weather, then the line ends without a follow-up. State records list his seasonal permit and a recent renewal for small engine fuel storage. No citation or complaint mentions him before the date the cabin door enters the file. A fisherman named Caleb Norton, 58, told friends he saw a skiff hugging the inside of Crab Bay that afternoon. He pointed to a notch where wind lines rarely flatten, suggesting the operator knew how to steal quiet water. The timestamp on his phone camera places him on the float when the skiff left the harbor. Some locals claim the man at the tiller wore a bright cap, though investigators never confirmed the color. The cabin sits back from a narrow cove where spruce hides most of the shoreline from passing eyes. Its porch faces southeast and catches thin light after noon when the tide pulls weed from the rocks. Records conflict on who last signed the logbook before Richard, and the ledger paper shows a rip that obscures a date. A county file from 2009 references a similar repair visit with no noted issues. 2 days later, a guide reported a skiff tied clean at the cabin float with the bowline doubled. The fuel can sat upright and dry, which usually means no scramble during landing. The porch steps showed shallow scuffs that looked like work boots rather than soft camp shoes. A hammer rested near the threshold with tape labels cut into neat strips. When the guide tried the door, he told officers it would not open past an inch at the latch. He felt no chain, but something firm stopped it before the inward swing could clear. The windows were closed and filmed with salt, but showed no obvious shapes inside. Investigators later wrote that pry marks were absent and the hinges looked normal from the porch. A wildlife officer named Hannah Ruiz, 33, reached the site after a short run from Whitestone Harbor. She logged light surf, weak rain, and a steady outflow that pushed the skiff sideways at idle. Her notebook says the latch plate aligned true, and the strike pocket showed no splinters or shims. She wrote that sound carried strangely in the trees and seemed to return from the far bank after each shout. They removed the hinge pins and tried to lift the door straight, which should release a standard interior catch. The slab rose a thumb's width and settled again as if trapped beneath by a weight. Hannah recorded that the floor gap showed only darkness and left her uncertain if a rug wrapped the threshold. Investigators never confirmed the presence of furnishings beyond a small table noted in older maps. A second attempt used a slim wedge to feel the interior space, guided by a small light and careful hands. The wedge met resistance that felt like stacked boards or a cabinet pushed flush, though measurements failed to agree. Some locals claimed a new cabinet had been delivered that week, which warehouse staff later denied. State records include no invoice for that item under Richard's seasonal account. They circled the cabin and checked every window frame for pry damage or fresh putty that might suggest an interior brace. One corner showed a streak that looked like boot rubber near the sill, leading back toward the steps in a faint arc. The ground held little shape because rain had erased crisp edges across the duff and needles. Archived notes mention a single nail in the dirt as if dropped during fastening work. The skiff carried Richard's tool crate with tape labels on nearly every handle and bit. Inside lay screws, sorted by length, and a folded sheet with hinge spacing drawn in pencil. The sheet uses block letters and short words that match notes found in his bunkroom ledger. The ledger mentions a plan to replace a warped slab if the existing door failed the swing test. Hannah radioed the harbor and asked for permission to breach the wall if a medical check demanded entry. The dispatch reply reportedly advised caution because ownership paperwork listed multiple agencies with overlapping rights. They decided to leave the structure intact until a supervisor could reach the site with written clearance. That delay is the piece that people return to when they discuss what happened next. During the pause, a weather line pushed down Icy Strait and dropped sleet across the cove until evening. The boats sat heavy at their lines and the shoreline disappeared behind a sheet that blurred the trees. A loud crack came from the porch like a board shifting under new pressure inside. Caleb later told friends the sound carried across water in a clean way he did not expect from wet wood. When the team finally entered the cabin, they did not use the door that prompted the call. They took a panel off the rear wall where an old vent had been sealed with light screws. The interior smelled of resin and cold ash from a stove that held no visible ember. Notes describe a floor swept clean and a cot made with square corners beneath a wool blanket. The obstruction proved to be a cabinet frame set tight against the latch side with shims that pressed the slab inward. The frame showed careful cuts that matched Richard's tool marks and tape labels for orientation. A finish nail still held a piece of blue tape with a handwritten arrow pointing toward the jamb. The tape carried a pencil line that read "Test Swing Only," which introduced the hardest question in the report. If Richard built the frame for a test, he needed a partner to release the pressure from the outside when he finished. The notes do not show a second worker on the schedule, and marina staff remember no one riding with him that day. Some locals claimed he trained a part-time helper earlier that month, but investigators never confirmed a name. Records conflict on whether a volunteer crew worked that week on nearby structures. A folded jacket hung behind the stove with a badge from a Juneau supply shop sewn near the cuff. Inside a pocket, they found a receipt for fasteners and a small envelope containing 3 screws shorter than the others. The receipt date reads early in 2019, and the vendor stamp matches Richard's earlier purchases. The envelope shows a faint smear as if handled in the rain before drying on warm metal. They checked the shoreline for signs of a second skiff that could have ferried a helper away after dark. The tide range that week was broad and wiped many edges clean between morning tides. A plank floated against the weeds with a staple at one end and pieces of blue tape stuck to its side. Caleb believed it belonged to the cabinet frame, though the cut length did not match easily. The cabin journal waited on the table with 3 lines that appear in Richard's careful hand. The first lists hinge spacing and a reminder to check swell along the bottom edge before planing. The second notes a stiff turn at the latch and a light bind he planned to measure again after tea. The third reads, "Door doesn't open and stops short at the margin without a period." A day later, a private pilot reported a lone figure near the mouth of Game Creek carrying a coil of line. The sighting time sits close to dusk when the flats take color and distance grows hard to read. The pilot reportedly radioed a brief note, then banked toward Teneke before weather closed the gap behind. Investigators never confirmed the figure's identity, and the area held no clear prints the next morning. State records show no bank activity on Richard's account after that week, and his room key remained on a nail. His brother came from Juneau and stood on the dock while officials summarized the findings from a short clipboard. He asked whether the door frame could trap a person by accident if a shim slipped under load. The answer in the file reads unlikely, but does not fully exclude a rare bind if weight shifts after pressure. A volunteer searched the shoreline toward Spassky and found a glove caught in alder a short walk from the cove. The glove matched the brand in Richard's crate, but showed different wear along the thumb where tape leaves residue. Some locals claimed the glove looked left-handed and too small for his grip. Investigators never confirmed whether Richard owned a second pair stored in the bunkroom drawer. County file copies include a note from 2009 describing a temporary brace for a door that stuck in spring. The brace used scraps and marked measurements similar to the recent cabinet frame that blocked the latch. The old note says "remove before occupancy" in small letters with a circle drawn around the line. The circle looks faintly like Richard's habit, though the comparison is not considered conclusive. A weather station near the mouth of Port Frederick logged a short spike of gusts on the night of the first delay. The spike coincides with the loud crack reported from the porch during sleet and falling light. Technicians wrote that siding can flex under wind and shift an interior frame, a fraction that changes pressure. That explanation sits in the file beside the question of who would place the frame so precisely. When the cabin reopened months later, the door swung true after planing and a fresh coat across the slab. The cabinet pieces were stacked neatly under the porch with labels still holding to their edges. A ranger added a line to the interior log, asking future workers to avoid test braces near active latches. Visitors still run a palm along the jamb and say the swing feels heavier than it ought to feel. Richard's name remains on a list of unresolved disappearances linked to coastal communities scattered across the archipelago. The list contains notes about boats, short flights, and quiet trails that meet the water before turning inland. Officials keep the file open and accept tips that reference times and places rather than theories. People in Hoonah speak evenly about such things and prefer facts that fit inside a ledger line. Some nights, the harbor grows very still and voices travel from the fuel float to the last finger pier. A deckhand will point toward the dark shape of Port Frederick and mention the door that started with a simple test. The older hands will nod and explain that wood moves when weather presses long across the grain. Then the talk returns to ordinary work while the cove lies quiet behind the trees. The Bridge Creek drowning that wasn't recorded. Locals in Deschutes County still mention a cold evening on Bridge Creek when a man vanished without an official entry. Witnesses later argued over the hour and the light while the water ran clear and slow beneath alder shade. The only certainty, according to archived notes kept in Bend, was that the call for help never landed where it should. The gap in paperwork turned an ordinary search into a puzzle that keeps reappearing in winter conversations. The man most often named was Trent Avery, 42, contract carpenter, in the area to price repairs on a seasonal cabin. He reportedly arrived 2 days earlier and slept in his truck near Sisters to save money, according to a motel clerk. The cabin owner said he never signed in or asked for a key because daylight was already fading near the ridge. The owner told deputies he expected a text that never came, which is a detail that repeats across later statements. Avery met one person that afternoon, a fisheries tech named Mara Collins, 34, state employee, checking culvert screens along a Forest Service spur. She said the creek looked safe for a crossing at the ford, which remained shallow where gravel spread across 2 tire lanes. Her state records log for that date lists water clarity as good and current speed as moderate with no debris above the culvert. She remembered a white cooler in his truck bed and a neatly folded jacket on the passenger seat. Dispatch logs from that week show wildfire smoke along the highway and intermittent tower issues between Sisters and Camp Sherman. A technician wrote that calls sometimes hopped east before returning, which could explain later confusion over which county heard the first report. A private tower contractor filed a brief noting brief resets during the evening hour when shadows lengthened across the creek. The record is not a smoking gun, but it sits near the time window witnesses describe. Collins said she left him near 5 while the light still held and the ford looked routine for any cautious driver. She told investigators he waved and asked about the old bridge pilings that stick from the bank near the bend. She reportedly replied that the pilings belonged to a logging ramp that washed out when storms changed the channel 2 winters back. She did not recall him stepping into the water or walking the gravel bar to test the footing. State records list a cloud front moving in from the northwest with cooler air that sometimes makes breath show at dusk. A ranger out of Sisters wrote that the creek often looks tame until a beaver dam upstream lets a pulse slide through. That can raise water a few inches quickly, which becomes meaningful in a narrow crossing where tires already press wet stones. The ranger did not say this happened that night, only that such pulses occur without sound along that reach. The first missing person alert does not exist in the county file from 2009, though later forms reference an original call. One deputy said the form might have been faxed to a non-emergency line that stopped accepting overnight traffic. Another deputy thought a visitor probably dialed from near the highway and hit the wrong jurisdiction due to the tower skip. The absence of a timestamp feeds the theory that information arrived in pieces and never landed in a single folder. 2 anglers claimed they saw a dome light blinking near the ford sometime after dark while the truck sat angled to the bank. They argued about whether the engine idled or whether they only heard water sliding against stones under the alders. Some locals claimed a third person approached the scene on a bicycle and left without speaking, though investigators never confirmed such a rider. Their statements match on the dome light detail and diverge on almost every other point. Avery's sister later provided archived notes from his phone bills that show attempts to call a Bend number around 8. The number belongs to the cabin owner who had already driven home to Redmond and silenced his ringer above the garage. Records conflict on whether a voicemail ever arrived because the carrier log shows activity while the device log shows only a missed call. The discrepancy is small yet meaningful when trying to place a voice in a narrow hour along the creek. Searchers walked both banks at first light and found boot tracks that entered from the gravel bar and faded where cobble turned firm. A tape measure in a photograph shows a stride that stays even then shortens near a shallow channel cut by the previous week rain. They recovered the white cooler 50 yards downstream, caught against willow roots, with the lid unlatched but nothing inside. The jacket remained on the passenger seat exactly as Collins described, which adds a quiet weight to her timeline. A retired deputy who reviews Coldfield files said the map grid for the initial sweep sits one square too far east. He blamed a habit of copying last season templates during busy weeks and missing small shifts in volunteer practice. That oversight pushes a key waypoint off the creek, which could explain why a thermal search missed a figure in the brush. He did not frame this as proof that someone waited there, only that the error changed where people looked first. In later interviews, a hardware clerk in Sisters remembered Avery buying a short toe strap and a shovel with a fiberglass handle. The clerk thought he mentioned a soft approach near a ford where ruts filled and needed a few minutes with a blade. The receipt time lines up with Collins and the ranger notes, which places him near the creek before dusk with reasonable tools. The purchase does not prove a crossing attempt, yet it keeps the possibility within a narrow band of motives. A volunteer firefighter described a call that almost arrived, a carrier ping that appears in a phone report but not in dispatch logs. He said the station door was open for inventory and the tone speakers clicked once without the usual follow message. He wrote his memory down years later for a training handout, which makes it more story than record. Still, several younger volunteers say they heard similar clicks during that month when the tower resets annoyed crews. Divers checked a pool downstream where the channel tightens and lifts small whirl lines against a rock rib under the bank. Visibility stayed poor due to fine silt stirred by a mid-morning wind and a brief flow rise from upstream wetlands. They found no clothing or wallet and no keys, which matches the detail that the truck cab stayed unlocked at the scene. The diver lead said the bottom felt mostly smooth with scattered roots that would have caught a heavy object easily. Weeks later, a property survey crew flagged a scrap of fabric trapped on barbed wire near a floodplain meadow. The piece looked like work pant material and carried fine silt that stains in the specific way Bridge Creek water does. A lab in Salem could not confirm much beyond weave and color range, which overlaps with common brands used by local contractors. The finding neither closes the case nor clears any doubts about the unrecorded call that started the confusion. Avery's truck eventually left the impound lot and returned to family after a modest court order that resolved a storage dispute. The odometer reading suggested little movement beyond the approach and the short angle found by deputies at first light. Tire pressure on the right front ran low enough to pull a light vehicle toward the wet edge during a cautious attempt. A mechanic said that detail matters only if a driver felt rushed and chose not to air up before crossing. Some residents claimed he might have walked out before midnight after losing patience with the patchy calls and weak signal near the ford. Others said a car picked him up on the highway and drove north toward Warm Springs, a route that thins quickly after dark. Investigators never confirmed either thread because camera coverage along that stretch remains limited and cash purchases leave quiet trails. The two stories survive because neither collides with the evidence found by the creek. Years after the search, a regional auditor reviewed communications procedures and noted that inter-county coordination improved during the next season. The report mentions additional training with tower vendors and a shared checklist when pings show cross-jurisdiction drift for emergency calls. None of that resolves where Avery went, yet it addresses the blank square where his first alert should have lived. The lesson sits quietly in meeting minutes while the creek keeps moving stones along the shallows. The file remains open in a narrow sense with periodic review when new hikers report odd finds in willow tangles after spring runoff. Most of those reports fade after a deputy drives out and looks where grass has already leaned and lifted again. The absence of a recovered body keeps speculation tethered to polite voices in diners near the highway and the mill. The story persists because the paperwork gap made a simple night on a small creek feel like an argument that never ends. The stories. Night guard who logged footsteps, no camera recorded. The night it happened, the security office at the old Westmore shipping depot smelled like dust and burnt coffee. According to shift logs, a 42-year-old guard named Dennis Halbrook clocked in at 11:30 p.m. and wrote a short note. Asterisk. Routine patrol. Clear floor. Humid tonight. Asterisk. He was the only guard on duty. By dawn, his chair was empty, his flashlight was lying under the main stairwell, and the building's cameras, 8 of them, showed nothing from the hours between midnight and 2. Westmore had been a Rust Belt landmark since the late 1970s, a concrete maze of loading bays and silent conveyor belts on the edge of a quiet Midwestern town. Dennis had worked there for 7 years, divorced, reliable, usually quiet. The kind of man who showed up early and read old paperbacks during breaks. That night was supposed to be uneventful, just a standard walkthrough before the building was scheduled for renovation. Around 12:10, he logged a line in the duty notebook kept beside the monitor screens. Asterisk. Footsteps on mezzanine catwalk, West Wing. Checked cams, no feed, asterisk. A minute later, asterisk. Still hearing it, will inspect, asterisk. That was the last thing he ever wrote. The plant's internal system backed up video every 6 hours. When investigators reviewed the footage from the mezzanine camera, the feed cut to static precisely at 12:08. Other cameras kept recording fine until 2:30, showing only flickering lights and empty halls. A maintenance worker named Harold Cortez arrived early that morning to replace fluorescent tubes on the ground level. He found Dennis's flashlight lying on its side, beam still weakly glowing, and the notebook open. No sign of struggle, no torn fabric, no blood. Just footprints, 2 sets tracked faintly through the dust. One set from Dennis's standard issue boots, the other, smaller, bare, leading to the freight elevator that hadn't worked in months. The county sheriff's department filed the case as a missing person. Official notes cited malfunctioning surveillance and probable equipment interference. But people who'd worked there doubted the malfunction explanation. Westmore's night tech, a woman named Carla Wynn, swore she'd serviced those cameras the previous week. They were old, but fine, she told local reporters. The cables were intact. You can't lose a feed that clean unless someone cuts power at the board. Dennis's sister, a nurse named Ruth, said he'd called her the night before. He'd sounded distracted, mentioning he'd found a second badge lying by the locker room door. She assumed he meant another guard's ID, but the company only issued one active credential, his. Archived building logs later showed the same badge used twice that night, once when Dennis clocked in, again at 12:11, opening the West Wing stairwell door. Whoever used it the second time moved toward the mezzanine exactly where Dennis had gone to investigate. By late summer of 2014, the company shut down the depot and cleared out the interior. Cleanup crews unearthed a small personal cassette recorder near a ventilation shaft behind the third bay. It contained about 30 seconds of audio, the hum of lights, a pair of quick footsteps, a metallic clank, then Dennis's voice saying, "Who's up there?" followed by a short distortion burst and silence. Audio engineers confirmed the tape had been magnetically warped, likely by exposure to a strong field, not heat or age. There was another strange detail buried in the sheriff's supplementary report, a mention of radio interference in patrol channels between 12 and 12:30. The on-call dispatcher logged fragments of words bleeding through static asterisk. Northgate, lights out, he's still here. Asterisk, none of the other guards were on duty that night, and the next scheduled patrol wasn't until morning. Years later, a local journalist named Owen Ralston revisited the case for a regional history program. He interviewed former employees and found that in 1998, 2 decades earlier, another guard, 39-year-old Gerald Pike, had disappeared during overnight maintenance. Same mezzanine, same missing camera footage, same unexplained power surge. Back then, the report blamed faulty wiring. Ralston tracked down Gerald's surviving son, who showed him an old Polaroid his father had taken before the disappearance. The photo captured the West Wing catwalk at night, lights flickering in the distance. In the lower right corner, partially blurred, was a faint silhouette that seemed to be looking down at whoever held the camera. Analysts couldn't verify whether it was a reflection or a person. But when the journalist compared the layout of that image with modern floor plans, he noticed something: the angle matched exactly where Dennis's flashlight was later found. What made it worse, the timestamp written in blue ink on the Polaroid's border, asterisk, the 3rd of April 1998, 12:11 a. M asterisk was identical to the digital record of Dennis's badge swipe, asterisk 12:11 a. M asterisk, two men, 16 years apart, logged in the same minute of the hour, in the same corridor, just before both vanished. Electrical engineers consulted during Ralston's project suggested a pattern of ground faults that might have caused rolling blackouts localized to one wing, possibly scrambling old analog video circuits. It could explain the synchronized failures, but they couldn't explain how both guards' ID logs and physical traces pointed to motion beyond any camera's field. In late autumn of 2021, the depot site was finally demolished. Before the demolition, a volunteer archivist named Leah Torres cataloged remaining items from the security office for the county museum. Inside a rusted filing cabinet, she found the original duty notebook sealed in a plastic evidence bag. Most pages were smudged, but the last line stood clear under the dried ink. Asterisk. Still hearing it. Will inspect. Asterisk. Beneath it, barely visible under a tilt of light, another faint line appeared, impressed by pen pressure, not ink. Forensic enhancement later revealed, asterisk, recording this time. Asterisk. That phrase matched an unfiled cassette found near Dennis's locker years earlier, the same type used for the warped tape. The archivist played it carefully on a restored deck. The audio was faint, but at the 13-second mark came what experts described as a pattern of steps, counted 7, then stop. The acoustics placed it roughly 10 feet above the ground, consistent with the mezzanine. When news of the find resurfaced, Ralston added an epilogue to his documentary. He pointed out that both the 1998 and 2014 incidents shared one quiet constant. The security logs always mentioned footsteps, but never the echo that should have followed in a steel-floored building. He speculated that the mezzanine's partial collapse during construction years earlier created a space that resonated oddly, bending sound in ways the old analog recorders couldn't track. Maybe, he said in the closing narration, what Dennis heard wasn't someone walking, but the building replaying itself. The official record lists Dennis Halbrook as missing, presumed deceased. No remains were ever found. The West Wing mezzanine was melted down with the rest of the metal. Today, the old depot grounds are a parking lot for long-haul trucks. Drivers who park overnight sometimes mention hearing boots pacing above the asphalt when the wind picks up, though there's nothing there, just open sky. Local radio traffic still gets random interference near mile marker 32, short bursts that resemble a steady rhythm of footsteps. At this point, the facts that remained were simple. Two guards, years apart, logged the same minute, heard the same sound, and left no image behind. The rest, whatever it was, stayed between the missing frames of a camera that never recorded and a notebook line that never should have been there. The stories. Dispatcher, who redialed a night number years later. The call that woke the overnight desk never finished cleanly, and the number that hung up stayed burned into memory. The report marked it as an incomplete welfare check request, and the audio ended right after a sharp breath. Leora Vance worked nights at a regional communications center, 36, steady voice, quick notes, routine coffee. She covered a patchwork of small towns around a river, and her goal that night was simple and ordinary. She wanted to make it through the shift with clean logs, then drive home before sunrise. At 2:43, the line flashed unknown number, and a woman whispered that somebody was on the porch. The voice cracked like cold glass, and static clipped the rest, so Leora asked the normal questions. The call died mid-sentence, and the return attempt fed a busy tone that rolled like a slow alarm. Protocol said, log it, dispatch a unit, and move forward with the map. She sent 2 cars across county lines, and she wrote porch contact unknown female, possible prowler, audio cutout. The officers found a silent street and a door light, and the porch camera showed only a moth. The address did not match the call trace, which often happened with rural switches. The closest relevant record was a break-in from 1998, and the same street used to be named differently on paper maps. The officers cleared without contact, and Leora filed it under incomplete with a notation on poor signal. She replayed the clip during the quiet hour before dawn, and she heard a faint tone behind the voice. She had a habit of catching tiny sounds people missed, and she logged them like breadcrumbs for later check. The tone matched the alert from older medical pendants, according to an equipment chart in her drawer. 2 days later, the number could not be connected, and the carrier reported a recycled pool of lines. A supervisor closed the incident as resolved by patrol presence, and life returned to the ordinary rhythm of alarms and traffic. Leora drove home through thin drizzle and told herself to let the record settle. Years slid by with new software and different chairs, and Leora moved into training and quality checks. She taught new dispatchers to separate panic from facts and to trust logs more than late-night adrenaline. She kept a notebook of unresolved lines, a quiet ledger of what the radio called ghosts. In 2005, a county audit required purging old tapes, and Leora requested the call as a training sample. She argued that the tape showed how to verify address data when signals bounced, and the review board agreed to preserve it. She placed the audio in a folder for classroom use, then forgot it for a while. In 2017, the center switched to digital recording with automatic transcription for flagged words. The legacy folder ported into the new system, and the software saw porch and pendant, then tagged it for quality review. Leora listened again and heard the same faint tone, which still felt wrong and unfinished. She noticed a rhythm behind the static, and it repeated every 6 seconds with small variants. A trainee suggested a smoke detector chirp, but the pattern felt too mechanical for a battery warning. Leora wrote a new note, and she marked it as likely device signal not from residents. A retired technician stopped by for coffee and heard the clip through an open speaker. He said the beeping sounded like a hallway alarm from a care facility, and the pitch matched certain wall units. He gave a rough model name from years earlier, and he shrugged in that cautious way field techs learn. Witness statements in older town council minutes mentioned a small facility that closed in 2006. The building sat at the edge of a service road near the river, and the license lapsed after staff shortages. The address never showed in the dispatch mapping tool, which favored current businesses and active residences. Leora searched archived calls around that road and found short bursts from unknown lines that year. Each clip cut off before a name, and the patrol responses found nothing but chain doors and dust. A maintenance crew had watched the property for a bank, according to one officer report from spring. She pulled tax records from the county site and found a change of ownership in 2007. The building title shifted to a holding company, which often meant redevelopment, which never came. A satellite photo showed a roof with patched squares and a light pole that leaned toward the access lane. The night number from the porch call mapped to a carrier block once used inside institutions. A policy note in an old binder described internal extensions that could overflow to outbound lines when certain failsafes trip. It was not proof, but it lined up with what the technician had described over coffee. She visited the records room on her lunch and requested dispatch logs for that road after 2006. The clerk pulled a slim folder with dust, and the sheets listed trespass checks requested by neighbors. No violent incidents were recorded, and most notes referenced animals and teens daring each other. A faded memo said interior power was cut to code years ago, and alarms were disconnected with a certificate. The memo was initialed by a contractor who later moved out of state, according to a local paperclip. The paper mentioned a minor zoning fight over repurposing, which stalled and faded. A rumor in a neighborhood forum referenced late-night lights near the loading door, reportedly seen by a delivery driver. The driver claimed to hear a tone like a distant truck backup, and then nothing after he blinked his high beams. The forum thread ended with jokes, and the administrator locked it after a week. Leora requested permission to run a courtesy check by phone on the legacy carrier block. She wrote that the new system showed occasional pings from inactive numbers, and she wanted to verify with the provider. The provider sent a bland letter that said non-billable pings could reflect maintenance checks, which proved little. She let it go again until 2021, when a cold storm knocked power around much of the valley. The center fielded hundreds of calls for downed lines and trees, and unknown numbers flooded the switch when cell towers failed. The old number flashed across a test screen, and a note in red tagged it as historic. It hit her in the middle of managing a pile of alarms, and she felt the odd gravity of unfinished work. Her trainee, a quiet analyst named Matteo Greer, saw her stare and asked what history followed that line. She explained the porch call, the tone, the closed facility, and the recurring pings during outages. He suggested a careful redial during low traffic hours, which fit policy when no private party would be disturbed. The number technically did not belong to a person, and the facility was listed as vacant in tax files. The watch commander noted no risk and approved a controlled test with recording flagged as training. At 3:10 the next night, Leora sat with Matteo in a side room and pressed redial on a clean console. The ring returned at a low volume, and a relay clicked before a voice picked up with a machine crawl. The voice said, "Reception desk. Please hold." The line stayed open with air and faint humming. Leora spoke carefully, and she used the generic script for a wellness verification at an inactive site. The line did not respond like normal interactive voice response, and the hum rose, then settled like heating vents. Matteo pointed to the waveform on the screen, and he traced a stair step that pulsed in threes. She said the center needed to verify status for a safety audit, and could a staff member confirm the building as empty. The voice returned with a single word, and it sounded like census, which made no sense for a desk. The hum changed to a thinner tone, and something clicked like a phone being set down. They stayed quiet, and a tiny echo carried an off-room sound that resembled elevator chimes. The building never had an elevator, according to the old permit in the zoning files, which listed 2 floors only. The chime could have been something else, or a bleed from another source through a carrier trunk. The call lasted 2 minutes, and then a hard click ended it with no final acknowledgement or goodbye. Leora logged every detail with exact time and the conditions of the room, plus the fact that a second console witnessed. She wrote that the voice felt recorded, but not like a standard system recording from that era. A next step followed policy, which said request a daytime site check with property access if possible. The sheriff office called the management company, which reported that the interior phones were long removed with certification. A maintenance vendor met deputies at noon, and the group entered through a side door with a stubborn hinge. They found clean air, paint flakes, and a smell like dry paper after long storage. No phones sat on desks, and no wiring hung from ceilings beyond bundled tubes cut and capped. A panel in the back room had a line of dead indicators, and a label from 2006 named the contractor. A back storage closet held a metal cabinet for telecom terminations, and inside a single light glowed green. The maintenance vendor said the light probably fed from a battery pack, which should have died many years earlier. He pulled the pack, and the light stayed green, which made him raise his eyebrows without a word. They traced the last live wire through conduit to a junction box near the loading door by the ramp. The box led to an old underground line that likely connected to a central office by the highway. The vendor said a ghost loop could be holding a stub signal, which might ring when jolted by storms. The explanation fit enough to calm nerves, and it gave the watch commander a line to give any curious council member. Leora filed the daytime result and waited for the routine to end, but her notebook felt heavier than before. She wanted something cleaner, a line that tied the porch call to a person. She checked archived calls for names near the facility in late 2005, and a surname appeared twice. The name belonged to a kitchen worker who reportedly stayed late to clean and who left town soon after closure. A short article from a community paper mentioned a farewell potluck in a church hall. A social post from years later showed a small photo of a medal on a refrigerator and a caption about nights that never end. The account had poor privacy settings, and it linked to a page for a caretaker group that offered mutual aid. The group had a public list of contacts, and one number matched the surname. She called during the afternoon from a staff phone and explained she was a dispatcher reviewing a historic alarm. The woman who answered identified herself as the former cook, and she said the night phones were a mess back then. She remembered plugging a line into a wall to ask for help during a snow night, then hanging up fast. The year matched the period before closure, and the memory included a porch light that never switched off correctly. The cook said a hallway alarm sometimes tripped when wind hit the wheelchairs stacked near an exit door. She said a pendant kept calling the desk after the resident moved, and staff joked about it. Leora asked if anyone had used an emergency night number taped under a desk, and the woman hesitated, then said maybe. She said an old laminated card listed a direct outside line for after hours when the main switch froze. She added that the card got lost during a water leak, and the sticker glue ruined 2 drawers. The detail matched a photo in the zoning files that showed bubbled plywood under a window near the desk. The water issue provided another path for odd faults, which could keep a line limping and ring when power fluctuated. The cook promised to look through an old box for any scraps, and she promised nothing more. Days later, an envelope arrived addressed to the center with no return, and inside lay half a laminated card. The text read, "Night number for direct line. Use only if house phones fail." The bottom showed 6 digits with 2 missing. The plastic edge was cracked, and a brown stain cut through the second line. Leora held the fragment near the recording console and felt the story settle into a shape that made sense. The porch call likely came from a staffer trying to poke through a dead switch, and the tone was the hallway alarm. The number carried forward through bureaucratic leftovers, and it rang when the storm hit the loop. She still needed the humane piece. The person whose whisper said someone was on the porch that night. She checked weather records for a cold snap that matched the reported snow night, and the timeline met the audit note. A dispatch log from the same week showed a trespass call at a different address with no contact. The officer who filed that trespass had retired to a nearby town, and he answered his landline on a sunny afternoon. He remembered a night when snow fell like ash and radios kept picking up carrier noise. He also remembered stopping near the old facility entrance, then leaving after seeing only footprints of a stray dog. He did not remember any porch lights, but he said the small homes nearby sometimes used helper bulbs that never slept. He also said staff from the facility used to walk to a bus stop at 4 in the morning after night shifts. The whisper could have been a staffer leaving alone, worried by a shape on the ramp. The theory fit and did no harm, and it honored the boundary between records and stories. Leora wrote a final entry into the training file, and she summarized the chain of evidence with careful language. She used reportedly, and dispatch logs and witness statements, and she added the laminated card as a scanned appendix. Before she closed it, she redialed the night number 1 last time to satisfy the part of her that wanted symmetry. The line clicked into a dead tone for 3 slow breaths, then released a single chime in silence. She sat still, then pressed stop, and saved the recording with a title that matched her steady heart. She did not post about it, and she did not share more than the classroom frame. The work of nights is often this quiet, a puzzle solved just enough to let people sleep. On her drive home, she watched a porch light fade behind a tree line and let the road carry the rest away. The woman who disappeared near Carver's Gap. Travelers who stopped at the high pullouts near Carver's Gap reported a woman who waved once, then walked into thin spruce. The trail ran along the bald, where wind hit with steady force from the Tennessee side. Lights stayed flat and cold despite late afternoon, and the ridgeline carried radio traffic from both counties. No one noted a plate because the parking area mixed hikers and locals without clear lines. The first call reached dispatch just before sunset, according to logs released later. Her name in the county file from 2009 matched a teacher who had moved between Carter and Avery over several years. She was 38 and worked part-time as a substitute while picking up seasonal museum hours in Johnson City. Friends said she came for the rhododendron bloom and stayed for the quiet above the state line. She reportedly carried a cheap handheld map and a stainless bottle marked with blue tape. Investigators never confirmed whether she owned a reliable compass, despite several receipts found in storage. The last certain sighting placed her near the wooden post where the Appalachian Trail heads north across the grass. A retired lineman named Carl said she asked about a side path that cut toward Round Bald before the weather turned. He described a calm voice and a careful walker who checked the sky twice and tightened her jacket sleeves. His watch read 4:30 by his account, and his memory stayed fixed on the sound of traffic below. Some locals claimed Carl changed the time later, which state records do not fully address. Dispatch logs mark a second report from a couple who parked beside a dented sedan with faded county stickers. They watched a woman stand near the information board and fold a copy of a trail brochure into a narrow strip. The man recalled her glancing at a silver pickup with an aftermarket light bar, then stepping away without hesitation. The woman recalled a slight limp that appeared only on the downhill portion near the first switchback. Records conflict on whether those statements were taken the same night or days later. Rain moved across Roan High Knob after dark, and patrols split between the paved lot and the forest roads. A ranger from the North Carolina side coordinated with a deputy from the Tennessee side using a shared radio channel. Volunteer searchers gathered near Carver's Gap just after midnight and walked grid lines under steady drizzle and shallow fog. They found boot marks that matched her size near a side trail where moss hid pooled water. Investigators never confirmed those impressions because runoff smeared edges before a cast could cure. Archived notes mention a lightweight day pack found under low branches around a quarter-mile from the main path. Inside were snack wrappers and a folded paper with a grocery list and a museum shift date. A phone sat in the outer pocket with a drained battery and a hair elastic wrapped twice around it. The screen held shallow scratches but no cracks, and the case showed a faded tourist sticker. Technicians pulled the card and recovered brief texts that ended earlier than the last reported sighting. Avery County reports list two unconfirmed leads involving a silver pickup seen idling near the pullout before rain. One hiker said the truck crept past the lot twice, which he found strange given poor visibility and slick pavement. Another hiker said the driver leaned forward and checked the mirror often while the engine surged at irregular intervals. Investigators never confirmed whether the pickup belonged to a local contractor who worked on fences near the highway. Records conflict on the license digits and the description of a sticker behind the rear glass. State records show a previous call involving the same teacher on Roan Mountain during early spring of 2019. She reportedly got turned around in sudden fog near Grassy Ridge and waited beside a cairn until voices approached. The party who found her said she stayed calm and kept talking about frost hollows and bird calls to stay oriented. An incident note described firm boots and a careful pace with brakes at regular intervals despite dropping temperature. Investigators never confirmed whether that episode affected her later planning or gear choices before June. In the week after the disappearance, family and colleagues organized small teams and checked shelters to the north. A museum co-worker carried printouts and asked pieced questions at hostels and gas stations between Elizabethton and Banner Elk. Several people remembered her spending coins on coffee and a pastry at a market near Roan Mountain State Park. Others insisted they saw someone else with similar hair and a similar jacket, which complicated the running timeline. The county file from 2009 contains those notes without a firm ruling on identity. A storm knocked power lines across the ridge and slowed organized searching while crews worked along the highway shoulders. Helicopter support reportedly stood by until wind readings dropped into a safer band above the open balds. Heat signatures came and went as fog shifted across gullies and pooled in low draws between thick spruce. Teams marked possible tracks that crossed and recrossed animal prints near a wet seep where runoff gathered. Investigators never confirmed a single continuous line that matched her boots from the parking area. Weeks later, a trail runner found a stainless bottle wedged under a root beside a shallow step. Blue tape clung to the metal, and a fingerprint technician lifted partials that matched previous samples from her apartment. The cap showed light grit and a torn gasket, which might explain a sweet smell noted by two searchers. Some locals claim the bottle had not been there during early sweeps, which raised questions about movement after rain. Records conflict on when the site was first photographed and tagged for follow-up. The apartment in Johnson City held careful stacks of notebooks and a shoebox filled with admission stickers. One notebook mentioned a plan to walk the balds alone to map views for a lesson about settlement routes. Another page listed bus times and an alternate ride from a coworker whose statement later changed on 2 points. The coworker first said she offered a ride to the Gap, then said she offered a pickup from the Gap. Investigators never confirmed either offer, which left timing gaps across the late afternoon window. Bank records show a small withdrawal that morning and no further activity after the day of the hike. A library card saw used 2 days earlier for field guides that matched the notes found near the daypack. A phone account tied to a prepaid plan rolled over minutes on schedule without manual action from family. Technicians found no logins after the last tower handshake near the state line on the ridge. Dispatch logs carry that timestamp and mark it as the final verified ping. A rumor formed around an old farm road that drops toward a creek where anglers leave crushed cans. A property owner told deputies about a woman who waved once near a locked gate before stepping into Laurel. He could not fix the date and changed the season at least twice during follow-up interviews. His dog growled at the brush that evening, and he found cords of stacked wood disturbed along the fence. Investigators never confirmed the account, and state records caution that memory shifted after news coverage. Later that summer, a faded sedan matching the parking lot vehicle was towed from a private lot near Elk Park. A shop owner said the driver left it overnight and never returned to settle a quoted repair. The owner thought the driver was male based on height and a cap pulled low across the brow. The tag returned to a different county, and paperwork took time because of mismatched mailing records. Archive notes say the lead produced no direct link to the missing teacher despite initial excitement. By fall, snow brushed the high grass, and searchers changed tactics to check drainages for winter evidence. Teams followed game trails where leaves bridged small streams and gusts erased prints within minutes. A jacket scrap turned up near a low snag, but color comparisons did not match clothing in photographs. A volunteer insisted the fabric felt similar to a liner she wore during spring trips on the same ridge. Investigators never confirmed the match, and records conflict on whether the sample was cataloged correctly. The museum held a small gathering where colleagues read notes about her lectures on birds and trade routes across the mountains. A student recalled her steady pace during a field trip and a habit of counting steps between viewpoints. Another student remembered a hesitant smile that appeared when someone mentioned weather reports and trail etiquette near fragile plants. Some locals claimed she had hinted at moving away, which her sister denied in interviews with a regional reporter. The county file from 2009 keeps both statements without comment on reliability. Winter closed the high road at intervals and ice grew along shaded cuts where plows could not hold traction. Crews marked fallen limbs and flagged slick corners, while visitors stayed lower in the valley towns. The case slipped from headlines but stayed in quarterly summaries prepared for both county commissions. Detectives traded notes about similar disappearances along the border where ridges tangle and lines divide jurisdiction. Investigators never confirmed meaningful overlap beyond weather patterns and occasional vehicle descriptions. In spring, a new ranger reviewed the folder and walked the first 3 miles north at dawn. He carried the printed dispatch logs and paused where the bale wire fence dips near a wet meadow. He noted how sound traveled along the bald and how voices blended with trucks grinding up the grade. A sudden shift in cloud shadow hid the post where the trail turns, and the path narrowed near wind-stunted trees. His memo suggested a simple misturn compounded by weather and fatigue without clear evidence of intent. Years have not settled the case, and no court file closes the matter with certainty. Reportedly, a hiker sometimes meets a man who still repeats the time and the steps and the exact wind. He stands by the wooden post and points where the grass folds over and the path looks wider than it is. Some locals claim she walked out on a different day and left by a service road near the towers. Investigators never confirmed that ending, and records conflict enough to keep the question alive near Carver's Gap.